What I observe unfolding along the line of control represents nothing less than the most dangerous nuclear flashpoint on Earth, where two nuclear powers with hair-trigger escalation doctrines face each other across disputed territory that could trigger nuclear exchange affecting 1.4 billion people, while the international community remains largely oblivious to the systematic escalation dynamics that could transform a regional border skirmish into comprehensive nuclear warfare within hours of initial conflict. The intelligence is clear, crystal clear, and both India and Pakistan maintain tactical nuclear weapons specifically designed for Kashmir conflict scenarios with deployment timelines measured in minutes rather than hours. Pakistani nuclear doctrine explicitly authorizes first use of nuclear weapons against conventional Indian military advances, while Indian massive retaliation doctrine threatens comprehensive nuclear response to any Pakistani nuclear use. This creates escalation ladders where limited border conflicts automatically progress toward full-scale nuclear exchange. What troubles me most profoundly is the systematic deterioration of crisis management mechanisms that previously prevented Kashmir disputes from escalating beyond conventional military confrontation. Recent intelligence indicates that both nuclear command structures operate under delegated authority, protocols that enable field commanders to authorize tactical nuclear weapon deployment without direct political authorization during communication disruption scenarios. I am analyzing intelligence assessments that detail systematic Pakistani state sponsorship of terrorist infiltration across the line of control designed to provoke Indian military retaliation that justifies Pakistani nuclear threats. Pakistan's inter-services intelligence agency coordinates with Kashmir separatist organizations and international terrorist networks, including Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, that conduct systematic attacks against Indian civilians and military targets. Congressional oversight of South Asian security reveals systematic coordination gaps between American alliance commitments to India through the Quad partnership and ongoing American dependence on Pakistani cooperation for Afghanistan operations and counterterrorism coordination. This strategic contradiction prevents effective American crisis intervention while encouraging both sides to believe that American support would favor their position during escalated conflict scenarios. The Chinese dimension of Kashmir crisis fundamentally alters regional nuclear dynamics through systematic Chinese support for Pakistani nuclear development and territorial claims that directly challenge Indian sovereignty, Chinese construction of the China-Pakistan economic corridor through disputed Kashmir territory creates three-way nuclear confrontation scenarios where Indian military operations against Pakistani positions could threaten Chinese infrastructure and personnel. The timeline for nuclear escalation in Kashmir scenarios operates according to compressed decision-making cycles that prevent effective international intervention. Pakistani tactical nuclear weapons can be deployed within 15 to 30 minutes of authorization, while Indian nuclear response capabilities operate under similar timelines. International diplomatic intervention requires hours to days for coordination, while nuclear escalation proceeds within minutes of initial trigger events. Regional spillover effects of Kashmir nuclear conflict extend far beyond immediate combat zones into comprehensive refugee crises affecting Central Asia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Nuclear weapon use in Kashmir would create immediate radiation exposure for millions of civilians while triggering massive population movements that exceed any previous refugee crisis in scale and urgency. And economic implications of Kashmir nuclear crisis extend beyond regional trade disruption into comprehensive collapse of global technology supply chains that depend on Indian software development, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and critical mineral production. Nuclear conflict in South Asia would immediately halt global technology operations while triggering financial panic that exceeds previous economic crises in scope and duration. Intelligence community assessments regarding Kashmir crisis escalation indicate systematic underestimation of nuclear threshold crossing probabilities, while crisis management mechanisms prove inadequate for addressing rapid escalation scenarios. American intelligence collection in Kashmir region faces systematic limitations due to Pakistani intelligence, counterintelligence capabilities, and Chinese electronic warfare systems that obscure nuclear readiness indicators. The terrorist proxy dimension creates systematic attribution challenges that enable Pakistani deniability while providing escalation triggers that operate below traditional state-to-state conflict thresholds. Terrorist attacks against Indian targets create political pressure for military retaliation that Pakistani military planners use to justify nuclear threat escalation. Water resource competition between India and Pakistan over Indus River system creates additional escalation vectors that combine territorial disputes with existential resource security, climate change effects on glacier melt patterns and monsoon reliability, intensify water competition while creating additional conflict triggers that operate independently of traditional territorial disputes. Alliance coordination for Kashmir crisis management faces unprecedented complexity as American alliance relationships with both India and Pakistan create conflicting commitments that prevent effective crisis intervention. Chinese alliance relationships with Pakistan through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Belt and Road Initiative provide systematic support for Pakistani positions against Indian territorial claims. The nuclear proliferation implications of Kashmir conflict extend beyond regional nuclear use into systematic demonstration that nuclear weapons provide effective leverage in territorial disputes that could encourage additional nuclear weapons development throughout regions facing similar territorial conflicts. Bangladesh, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other regional powers observe Kashmir nuclear dynamics as indicators of nuclear weapons utility for territorial coercion. Military capabilities for Kashmir conflict scenarios reveal systematic advantages for Pakistani forces operating from defensive positions, while Indian conventional superiority creates incentives for Pakistani nuclear escalation to prevent territorial losses. Pakistani military doctrine explicitly incorporates tactical nuclear weapons as defensive tools against Indian conventional military advances across the line of control. Information warfare coordination between Pakistani intelligence services and Chinese information operations systematically amplifies Kashmir territorial disputes while portraying Indian military responses as disproportionate aggression that justifies international intervention against Indian positions. This information coordination creates international pressure against Indian military responses while providing political cover for Pakistani nuclear threats. Counterterrorism coordinations between Indian OCHAN and American intelligence services reveals systematic Pakistani support for terrorist organizations that conduct operations against both Indian and American targets. Pakistani intelligence services maintain operational relationships with Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Kashmir-focused terrorist groups that create systematic security threats throughout South Asia and beyond. The humanitarian catastrophe potential of Kashmir nuclear conflict includes immediate civilian casualties from nuclear weapon effects, long-term radiation exposure, massive refugee movements, and comprehensive economic collapse affecting the entire South Asian subcontinent. Nuclear weapon use in densely populated Kashmir valleys would create immediate humanitarian emergencies that exceed international response capabilities. Recovery scenarios from Kashmir nuclear conflict require comprehensive regional reconstruction, refugee resettlement, and economic rehabilitation that exceed reasonable international assistance capabilities, while long-term radiation effects and environmental contamination create permanent displacement of millions of people throughout the region. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that Kashmir represents more than a regional territorial dispute. It represents the most dangerous nuclear flashpoint in the world where systematic escalation, dynamics, crisis, management, failures, and great power competition create optimal conditions for nuclear conflict that could fundamentally alter regional and global security for generations. The decisions made about Kashmir crisis management, nuclear proliferation, prevention, and regional alliance coordination will determine whether South Asia remains a region of economic development and democratic progress or becomes the epicenter of nuclear catastrophe that destroys the prosperity and security of over 1 billion people.